Are you there, Kathy?
I am. If they can just pull my presentation on. I'm just going to turn on my camera to say hello, and then I'm going to turn it off if that's okay with you.
Just give us a second. We can see you. Thank you very much for showing your face. Coming to us from which part of Australia?
Sunshine Coast. A friend of mine was getting married, so.
No, it's fine. For those that may not know, where exactly is Sunshine Coast? Because not many of us are familiar with Australia.
So it's above the Gold Coast and above Brisbane, about an hour out of Brisbane. So
thank you very much. When you say sunshine, we think of other things in South Africa.
Very hot.
Yes.
That's pulling up your. That's even more complicated.
Yes, exactly.
Gold Coast and all.
That's fine. So we're just pulling up your presentation. We're gonna be with you now. Just give us a second. We're just trying to manage a couple of issues here in-house. Give us a second. Almost. And then, Kathy, if you can just try and stick within the 10 minutes and then just indicate to us the next slide. Again, you don't have to touch on all the issues. We are going to have a number of interactions after that, and I'm sure those interactions can pull out all of the detail that you may skip in your presentation. Thank you.
Super. Right, so if we can just go to the next slide, please.
Yep.
So just to let you know that this is part of a group of about 140 slides. So I've had to try and pick a few that are probably most relevant and tell a story. So essentially, if we look at the cannabis sector, if you can just go to slide 2, please. We've run quite a detailed process. We've run an online survey. We've run several focus group discussions. We've undertaken a lot of desktop research as well. And there are a couple of issues that keep coming up, thematically. So we know that the regulatory uncertainty is the biggest stumbling block in the sector. It actually prevents the sector from growing. The way that the regulatory environment is actually structured, we have a lot of supply. It stops at the farm gate. We can't actually move it along the value chain, which creates a lot of problems. As a result of the regulatory framework, the private sector is not prepared to really step in and provide finance in the sector. So we have very little investor confidence. We have huge compliance challenges as well. Market development and sort of the informal market are all issues in the sector. Coming to Garth's point as well, when we did issue out the surveys, we had about 180 respondents, of which about 71 of them were complete, half of which are licensed, the other half are not. And the typical issues around access to finance, access to markets, red tape, support from government are some of the typical issues that keep coming up. And another issue that was raised is also that it's not just about, access to finance and financial support, but growers and investors in the sector that are keen to help the sector grow are also looking at business development support, which is just beyond financial support only. If we can go to the next slide. And I'm going to go through that slide relatively quickly because I'm going to want to go to the slide after that. So what's important about this slide is it tries to help us think through the different layers of a business and how we fund it, really. So we've got to think about the business where it is in its business life cycle. Some of the work that we've done in the small business space, not just in hemp specifically, but just overall for South Africa, we find that we have a lot of businesses that have been around for about 20 years and they're still in the survival phase, which is hugely problematic. And I think that the hemp and cannabis sector are probably no different. So we need to provide support across the entire value chain, and we need to look at the different types of funding classes. So is it going to be government grants? Is it going to be funded through DFIs? Are we looking at the private sector for formal commercial funders, etc.? Or are we looking at the private sector coming in terms of alternate finance, so angel investors, crowdfunding, joint venture capital, blended finance, etc.? Then on the right-hand side, you actually see we've got to look at it in terms of the different parts of the value chain, as Garth was talking about it. So are we looking at upstream, midstream, or downstream? So we need to think through those different layers. And then we've also got to think around the different demand pathways. So are we looking at medicinal, traditional, cosmetics, etc.? And what is quite clear is that there are actually 3 types of the product that we need to think about. So one is, very high THC levels, probably lower CBD, and there it's medicinal cannabis. It's got to be highly regulated, and there it requires very strict rules. And so to meet the requirements there, we have to ensure that the funding requirements meet the very strict compliance monitoring requirements as well. Then we've obviously got high CBD, but not high THC, and that's in the mid-ground. And then if there's low CBD, at the end of the day, that's hemp, and that should be unregulated and allow the industry to grow. So we're looking at that for industrial purposes as well. Next slide, please. So to a large extent, this slide, and it's a very busy slide, and I'm not sure how clear it is, but this really tries to look at the different funding options that are available across the different types for the different stages that you are in the business life cycle. And then in the report, we really try and unpack this according to the different parts of the value chain. So for example, in the hemp sector, we actually see that there's huge need for support on the seed ecosystem, because we've seen that seeds are hugely problematic and access to them is hugely problematic. But we see that there's more demand in the midstream processing side and downstream. Whereas for cannabis, I think we see that there's a much larger need in the upstream part to really try and set up the farms properly to make sure that they're compliant, to get all the GMP certificates, etc., so that they can actually compete in order to export as well, not just for local demand. So we unpack some of those things in the report and some of the thinking as well. In terms of our thinking around the 3, we've come up with 3 different options for funding. So one is within the current regulatory environment, which as long as the sector remains regulated in the current space, there's not a lot that the private sector or that government can really do and the private sector can do, but you can draw on alternate funding options. So for example, carbon finance, because hemp is a fantastic carbon sink. You can look at angel investment, we can look at crowdfunding. So we've got to look at alternate funding forms. Whereas if we regulate the industry and we open it up, so we deregulate it, we can actually start accessing a lot of the formal channels that would be available. And what we do push for quite strongly is for a regulatory sandbox, and that is really to try and create a protected environment to support our legacy farmers. And the thinking around that is, if you in that regulated space, you'll be licensed across the entire value chain. And then in that space, you can operate quite freely while being monitored, and that way you can actually grow. And I want you to move to the next slide, please, which will probably be my last slide. So this is really, we're trying to emulate the Okahlamba case, which is quite a nice example of a completely stitched up value chain that actually benefits the community across the entire value chain. And so we think that this is probably a nice way to actually set up a regulatory sandbox environment where you literally have so if you see where it starts off, you have the community coming together. They really decide what they want to grow. Are they trying to grow medicinal cannabis? Are they trying to produce hemp for industrial purposes, so hempcrete, clothing, textiles, biofuels, etc., or biocomposites? Then from that will actually determine to a large extent what the license or permit actually looks like. That then allows for the cooperative to be set up that actually licenses or applies for the license through the normal traditional authority. Then they work very closely with DALRAD and the municipality to make sure that they can access these licenses. DALRAD actually provides resources to put up fences, etc. The municipality then helps unlock a lot of the municipal infrastructure grant finance, which is in the conditional grant. That then allows them to actually produce and cultivate with the relevant permits that they have. The nice thing about the Okahlamba case is that it also has training and skills development attached to it. So you actually get trained through the relevant CETA. You get taught through Cheetah and Druid's Garden as well. And then essentially, while they're growing for industrial purposes, they've actually they've created a special purpose vehicle, which is really a company that is buying all of the product from the community and from the co-ops as such, and then they're actually processing it, testing it, aggregating it, moving it to market, and then finally processing it through infrastructure, getting it to market at the end of the day, and even exporting it. And if you go to the next slide, you'll actually see that they have a relatively complex structure that is in place. If you can go to the next slide, please.
We can see it on our side.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's just come up from mine. So this actually shows you that there's quite a complex structure in terms of these organizational structures where you've got the traditional authorities, you have these co-ops that have been set up, the co-ops actually producing, but the community, our traditional and our legacy growers are actually part of these traditional authorities. They're part of the co-ops. They're also members of the special purpose vehicle, which is a company. The special purpose vehicle has a working group or a committee, an investment committee that has representatives from the municipality, from the district development agency, from DELRAD sitting on it. And then obviously they are responsible for processing, agro-processing, etc. Druid's Garden actually has a contract agreement in place, an offtake agreement where they're actually buying all of the product for them and sending it off to market. They're actually doing all of that processing. And then if we go to the very last slide, and then I am finished, if you can just pop onto that last slide. So essentially, we look at these three options. The one is obviously in the current regulatory environment. The second one is really to do what Garth is saying, set up this regulatory environment to actually sandbox and test, learning by doing. So creating as many of these similar Oklahoma type environments within each of the provinces at the local level, so working with the district development agencies as well as the rural development agency, and then eventually moving towards the final phase and future state, which is really where everything has been deregulated. But let's not wait to get to stage 3. Let's currently ring fence companies within phase 2, which is to create this regulatory sandbox environment in which we can test, play, and make sure we stitch up the entire value chain so that everybody can actually benefit and grow. And that's it from me.
Thank you. Before you go, just a quick follow-up question, just abusing my powers. Just
Sure.
give us an idea of, and when you say short-term option 1, what are the timeframes for doing that?
So option 1 is the current space. So, as Garth has said, some of the changes are coming about. So we're seeing some reform there, but that would be immediate. It really is about finding creative funding streams for that. So a little bit more difficult in that space. Option 2 is to set up the regulatory sandbox, and that would probably take, I would assume, about 3 years before you go through the various planting cycles, you're testing, you can actually move across the value chain. So I don't think that even phase option 2, which is something you could start now, because you're basically awarding licenses and allowing those firms and enterprises across the value chain to be licensed, to be operated, and to operate in a safe space. And the advantage of that is it actually prevents international competition from coming in, because you haven't opened up the market. So you're allowing South Africa to incubate the domestic cannabis and hemp sectors to grow within those spaces, allow them to grow, learn, test, etc., keep reiterating, refining the process, improving, so that that can eventually go to market. And you could decide at a later stage if you want to fully deregulate or still just continue to operate with more and more players in the sandbox environment at a provincial level.
Thank you very much.
It's a very long answer.